April 21, 1956, 2 a.m., East Berlin. Soviet maintenance workers dig through muddy ground, searching for a flooded cable vault. Their shovels strike something impossible, a steel wall, underground, 300 yards inside communist territory. What they discovered shouldn't exist. A passage running 1,476 feet beneath the most heavily guarded border on Earth. Built in absolute silence, filled with equipment resembling a battleship's communications center. The Americans had done the impossible. They dug their way into the Soviet Union's secrets. The engineering challenges they solved would make this one of the most audacious technical operations of the entire Cold War. This is how American construction teams solved an impossible puzzle, one that would be rejected as fiction if it weren't documented fact. A challenge requiring invented techniques, defeating impossible odds, and working under the noses of thousands of enemy soldiers who would shoot on sight. But what they didn't know was the operation had been betrayed from day one, and that betrayal would make their technical achievement even more extraordinary.
To understand why they attempted something this insane, we need to go back to 1951. The Soviet Union had detonated its first hydrogen bomb in August 1953. Western intelligence agencies faced a terrifying dilemma. They'd gone almost completely blind. Throughout the late 1940s, the CIA and British intelligence had been intercepting Soviet radio transmissions, learning about Red Army movements, military capabilities, and strategic planning. Then suddenly, silence. Moscow had switched from radio to underground telephone cables. In Berlin, the situation was critical. The city was divided into 4 sectors: American, British, French, and Soviet. Soviet military headquarters at Zossen, just outside Berlin, coordinated operations across Eastern Europe. Every order, every troop movement, every strategic discussion traveled through buried cables, completely invisible to Western intelligence. CIA officer Bill Harvey, a former FBI agent known as America's James Bond, arrived in Berlin in 1952 with a mandate to find solutions. Harvey was the kind of operative who carried a pistol at all times and had famously exposed Soviet spy Kim Philby. He needed something bold. Then German intelligence chief Reinhard Gehlen provided crucial information. 3 major Soviet communication cables came together at a single junction near Schönefelder Chaussee, a busy highway on the Soviet side. The cables were buried less than 6 feet underground. The junction was only 300 yards from the American sector border. Harvey saw opportunity. If they could tap those cables, they'd access virtually every Soviet military communication in Eastern Europe. Just one obstacle: those 300 yards were the most heavily patrolled border on the planet. Guards with dogs, watchtowers, floodlights, regular patrols. Any surface approach meant suicide. So Harvey proposed something insane: go underground. The British had successfully pulled off a similar operation in Vienna under Operation Silver. But Berlin presented difficulties Vienna never had. Soil conditions were worse: sandy, unstable loam that could collapse instantly. The distance was much longer. Border security was exponentially tighter. Any noise or ground subsidence would immediately trigger Soviet investigation. In December 1953, Director of Central Intelligence Allen Dulles gave it a green light. Codename: Operation Gold. The British called it Operation Stopwatch. The mission: dig from American territory under the border 300 yards into Soviet-controlled East Berlin and tap cables without anyone noticing. Do it in secret, in silence, under the noses of thousands of enemy soldiers. The engineering challenges were staggering. Consider the specifications. Dig 1,476 feet through unstable soil. Maintain perfect alignment without surface surveying. Remove 3,100 tons of earth without anyone noticing. Work in complete silence. Prevent ground subsidence. Cross under the world's most dangerous border. How do you aim without surface surveys? How do you dispose of enough soil to fill 20 average American living rooms? How do you work silently with heavy equipment? These weren't just engineering problems. They were puzzles no textbook covered. Solutions would need inventing.
Among British intelligence officers attending early planning meetings at 2 Carlton Gardens in London was George Blake, impeccably credentialed, trusted, a rising MI6 star. Blake was also a KGB mole. Within days of first planning sessions in 1951, Blake informed Soviet handlers about every detail: the route, target cables, technical specifications, everything. The KGB faced an agonizing decision: shut down the operation immediately and expose Blake, one of their most valuable agents inside British intelligence. Moscow made a calculated choice: let it proceed, sacrifice some military communications rather than lose their source. But here's the fascinating part. The KGB kept the secret so tightly they didn't even tell their own military. Officers using those phone lines at Zossen had no idea their conversations were monitored. East German Stasi wasn't informed. Even the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, remained in the dark. The KGB reasoned the best way to protect Blake was letting it operate exactly as Americans and British planned. They'd allow intelligence to flow, then discover the passage later in a way that looked accidental. So as American construction teams began their impossible task, Soviets watched but didn't interfere. This created one of the strangest situations in Cold War history. Both sides knew about the operation, but only one side knew that the other side knew. According to declassified CIA reports, there were no known Soviet attempts to feed disinformation through tapped cables. The Soviet military continued using lines for genuine communications of intelligence value. Moscow valued Blake so much they feared his exposure more than a breach of their secrets. The Americans were about to build something extraordinary, and Soviets were going to let them, all to protect one British traitor. But the real breakthrough wasn't the espionage angle, it was engineering. The technical problems Leslie Gross and his team were about to solve would change underground construction forever. Soviets might have known the operation existed, but they couldn't have known Americans were about to invent techniques that would revolutionize construction for the next 70 years. Lieutenant Colonel Leslie M. Gross got the call in early 1954. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had exactly one officer with actual tunneling experience, him. He faced the most challenging construction project of his career. First dilemma: how do you aim when you can't conduct surface surveys? The solution required cutting-edge technology. CIA photo reconnaissance flights over Berlin captured images on glass plates, the most accurate photographic medium available. Air photogrammetry specialists analyzed images to calculate precise distances and elevations to target cables. But they needed more precision. Construction teams deployed a newly developed electronic distance measuring system. A CIA agent faked a flat tire on Schonefelder Chaussee, right near the cable junction. While pretending to work on the wheel, he placed a small electronic device on the car hood. The device fixed exact coordinates of Soviet cables. Two independent systems, aerial and electronic, confirmed identical targeting data. They now knew exactly where to dig. Second dilemma: the soil. Berlin sits on sandy loam deposited by ancient glaciers. Worst possible material for underground construction: soft, unstable,
prone to collapse. Traditional mining methods, like timbering, wouldn't work for covert operations. They needed something pushable forward without creating noise or vibration. The answer was the shield method. A shield is essentially a large steel tube with a cutting edge. Hydraulic rams push it forward. Workers excavate soil inside the tube. Rams push the shield forward another foot. Behind the shield, workers quickly install cast iron liner plates, curved sections bolting together, forming a permanent wall. Methodical, relatively quiet, prevents collapses. The CIA contracted a manufacturer to build a custom 6-foot diameter shield with hydraulic propulsion. They ordered 1,700 cast iron liner plates and 125 tons of steel components. Third dilemma: 3,100 tons of excavated soil. You can't haul truck after truck of dirt away from a warehouse in Cold War Berlin without attracting attention. The solution was audacious: store it all on site. They built a warehouse in the Rudau district of West Berlin, right near the border, but not a normal warehouse. Plans called for an incredibly deep basement, 7 meters down, large enough to drive a dump truck through. When civilian contractors saw blueprints, one construction manager quit in disgust. Why build a cellar big enough to drive through with a dump truck? The design made no sense. It violated every normal construction principle. The U.S. Army Chief of Engineers finally stepped in and ordered the warehouse built as specified, calling it an experiment. The deep basement would serve as both staging area and storage for every cubic foot of excavated earth. The operation now had its cover: a warehouse with a radar station on the roof. To anyone watching from Soviet territory, it looked like a standard military communications facility. Inside that warehouse, in that unusually deep basement, American soldiers would dig their way into enemy territory. The pieces were in place, the techniques designed, the cover established. Now came the hardest part: actually digging.
September 2nd, 1954. The dig began. Inside the warehouse basement, workers excavated a 10-foot vertical shaft. They assembled the shield in the shaft bottom, then started pushing horizontally toward East Berlin. The process was relentless and methodical. Push the shield forward on hydraulic rams. Excavate 12 inches of soil inside the shield. Retract rams. Install a ring of liner plates in newly exposed space. Bolt plates together. Grout the void between plates and surrounding earth. Push forward again. Repeat. A wooden rail track guided a small battery-powered forklift, hauling excavated soil back to the vertical shaft. From there, workers dumped it into the warehouse basement. Day after day, ton after ton, the basement filled with sandy Berlin soil. Just 10 feet in, they hit their first disaster. The shield broke through into an undocumented pre-World War II cesspool, a sewage pit maps didn't show. Contaminated water flooded the passage. Workers scrambled, installing pumps and draining the mess. The stench was overwhelming, but they couldn't evacuate or call for help. The operation was top secret. They dealt with it and kept digging. The bore required absolute precision. Every fourth ring of liner plates included grout plugs, threaded cores that could be unscrewed. Workers pumped special grout called volplay through these holes to fill the half-inch void between structure and undisturbed earth above. This prevented ground subsidence that might alert Soviet patrols. One boxcar full of volclay disappeared between Chicago and Baltimore. It took 5 days to locate the shipment. Any delay could compromise everything, but grout arrived just in time.
The dig proceeded at roughly 15 feet per day, agonizingly slow, but this was silent work under enemy territory. Teams rotated in shifts, working around the clock. Officers and enlisted men lived in the warehouse, never leaving the compound. Security was absolute. Throughout entire construction, the passage was rigged with explosives. If Soviets discovered it during construction, U.S. Army Major General Charles Dasher had orders ready: detonate charges and collapse everything, destroying all evidence. The demolition plan was only canceled at the last minute when Dasher concluded such an explosion could potentially trigger World War III. As excavation progressed, workers installed sandbags along completed section sides. They filled bags with excavated soil and stacked them halfway up sides, secured with steel cables. This created bench-like platforms supporting air conditioning ducts, power cables, and communication lines running between tap chamber and recording equipment. 8 months later, on February 25, 1955, the shield broke through to a predetermined stopping point. They dug 1,476 feet, almost 5 football fields, through unstable soil, under the Cold War's most dangerous border, in complete silence. Phase 1 was complete, but the real breakthrough was still ahead.
British Army Captain Peter Lunn, a former Olympic alpine skier and MI6 officer, now faced the most technically demanding challenge of Operation Gold. The main passage had reached Soviet territory. Now they needed digging a vertical shaft upward from the bore's end to reach cables buried just 19 inches below Schonefelder Chaussee. 19 inches. That's all the margin between target cables and the busy road above, a road used daily by Soviet military trucks, staff cars, and armored vehicles. The British team from Royal Engineers brought a specially designed device they called the mole, essentially a vertical shield, a controlled way to dig upward through soft, crumbly soil without causing surface collapse. The technique was painstaking. They used what's called a window blind method. Open a slot, remove 1 inch of soil, close that slot. Open the next slot, remove another inch, close it. Repeat. Inch by inch they carved upward, supporting soil as they went. This required extraordinary patience and skill. Work too fast, and the road above might suddenly develop a sinkhole, instantly alerting Soviet authorities. Work too roughly, and cables might be damaged, cutting off the very intelligence they were trying to intercept. British Post Office telecommunication specialists, the best cable technicians in the world, handled actual tapping. 3 men, Blake Reimer, considered Britain's finest cable joiner, Les Sparks, and Arthur Looms. They worked with surgical precision. On May 11, 1955, 11 months after the dig began, they tapped the first cable, then the second, finally the third cable, which was in poor condition but still carrying traffic. The taps had to be invisible. Cables couldn't show any voltage drop, signal degradation, or impedance change that might alert Soviet technicians during routine testing. The British team installed amplifiers and signal processors to capture communications without leaving any detectable footprint. The tap chamber itself resembled a battleship's communications center. British-made equipment lined walls: amplifiers, transformers, signal splitters, monitoring devices, everything labeled in English, a detail that would later feature prominently in Soviet propaganda photographs. Intelligence flowed to banks of Ampex tape recorders installed on the warehouse's first floor. Initially, 150 tape recorders ran continuously, later expanded to 600 machines. Reels of magnetic tape captured every phone call, every teletype message, every communication flowing between Soviet military headquarters and forces across Eastern Europe.
By summer 1955, Operation Gold was fully operational. The passage was listening. Within weeks of operation, construction teams noticed something alarming. The equipment room, located under the roadway, was overheating. The tap chamber was crammed with amplifiers, transformers, tuners, and signal processors. All used vacuum tubes, generating enormous heat. Original air conditioning calculations were wrong. Temperature was rising dangerously. This wasn't just a comfort issue, it was a security catastrophe waiting to happen. Winter was coming. On a cold Berlin morning, what would happen when frost formed everywhere except for a mysterious warm patch above the equipment room? The thermal signature would literally point Soviet investigators directly to the operation. The CIA specialist who designed the structure was urgently summoned back to Berlin. His analysis was grim. They needed supplemental cooling immediately, but there was no room for additional air ducts. The solution was a chilled water system using newly developed plastic irrigation tubing, 3/4-inch diameter lines that could snake alongside existing air ducts. The system was shipped to Berlin and installed just before winter. They still needed temperature monitoring. A New Jersey company named Wallace and Tiernan provided a remote temperature recording system. Specialists drilled through grout plugs and inserted sensors at strategic points, 1 in the tap chamber, 4 in the equipment room, 3 in the main passage, and 3 at the entrance as controls. The final step was pounding a hole through 16 inches of reinforced concrete in the warehouse basement floor to route sensor cables to the recording station. It took 3 days of hammering with a star drill. The system worked. Ground temperatures above the equipment room dropped to match surrounding area. The thermal signature disappeared. For 11 months and 11 days, Operation Gold functioned exactly as designed, from May 11, 1955 to April 21, 1956. The intelligence harvest was staggering. 443,000 fully transcribed conversations, 50,000 reels of magnetic tape, 40,000 hours of telephone communications, 6 million hours of teletype traffic, 1,750 intelligence reports. Teams of 317 Russian émigrés and German linguists in London transcribed recordings. They heard Soviet officers discussing troop movements, equipment shortages, maintenance difficulties, personnel issues. Then came April 21, 1956. Soviet and East German soldiers broke into the eastern end. Officially, they were responding to flooded cable vaults. That spring had been unusually wet. Whether the discovery was accidental or staged by the KGB remains debated. George Blake had been transferred from Berlin in late 1955, and Moscow no longer needed maintaining the charade. American operators heard the breach through hidden microphones. They activated emergency protocols and evacuated. The Soviets invited international press for a propaganda coup, but it backfired spectacularly. World media portrayed it as brilliant engineering. Headlines praised audacity and technical sophistication. Instead of embarrassing the West, discovery enhanced the CIA's reputation. It wasn't until 1961, when George Blake was arrested, that Western intelligence realized the operation had been compromised from day one. Operation Gold cost between $6.7 million and $25 million. The techniques developed influenced underground construction for decades. The shield method they refined is still used in subway systems worldwide. Signal tapping technology, pioneered by British specialists, became the foundation for modern communications intelligence. Today, a 40-foot section is displayed at the Allied Museum in Berlin. The CIA Museum in Washington holds components. The International Spy Museum exhibits another segment. If you want more stories of technical problem solving from military history, hit subscribe and ring the notification bell. Next week, how Allied specialists broke German Enigma encryption through mechanical genius Churchill called Britain's secret weapon. What technical challenge should we cover next? Drop suggestions in the comments. Until then, remember, the greatest victories often happened underground, in silence, where specialists solved difficulties that changed the world.